Russia's ambassador to Turkey is killed in cold blood in Ankara, the gunman shouting, "I did it for Aleppo." The scene in Aleppo itself tonight amid sub-zero temperatures. Fires lit along the crossing point out of the besieged east of the city as tens of thousands still await the buses and as the killing in Ankara brings fresh uncertainty. Good evening. It is a volley of shots resounding around the world. Somehow the gunman had mingled with the ambassador's close protection. Turkish security sources are saying tonight he was an off-duty policeman. The ambassador had been speaking at an art gallery in Turkey's capital, Ankara. One shot felled him. The gunman then threatening others to leave, shooting the ambassador again, before shouting, "This is for Aleppo." The gunman was then himself killed. Tonight, the latest, and we talked to the United Nations' Jan Egeland about the Aleppo exodus.
It could be done in another 24 to 48 hours if everything goes right and we have this continuous operation through the night and the morning.
Also on tonight's programme, industrial action brings Christmas chaos with the prospect of strikes at the post office, the Royal Mail, on the trains and planes. And now even breakfast is in jeopardy as Weetabix staff threaten to make it serial walkouts in the new year. The Defence Secretary admits Saudi-led forces in Yemen have used cluster bombs supplied by the UK government, but claims the Saudis have promised to stop. And hopes Britain can strike a swift trade deal with Australia, as Theresa May is accused of a shambolic approach to Brexit. We asked the top diplomat from Down Under why he believes the Poms will find life is sweet outside the EU.
It was as shocking as it was sudden. The Russian ambassador to Turkey shot dead right in the centre of Ankara by a gunman who shouted "Allahu Akbar" and "Do not forget Aleppo" as he opened fire. Reports claim the assassin was a 22-year-old off-duty police officer. In the last few minutes, Turkey has condemned what it called a lowly terrorist attack, saying it wouldn't allow it to cast a shadow over its relations with Russia. Our chief correspondent Alex Thompson has the latest and a warning there are some distressing scenes in his report.
Moments before it happened, the still shows Ambassador Andrei Karlov at the microphone. Behind him, one man, apparently a security guard. That man is then filmed firing a handgun 9 times. The gunman shouts in Turkish, "Don't forget Syria, don't forget Aleppo. If people aren't safe there, you won't be safe anywhere." He then continues in Arabic, "Allahu Akbar, God is great." The audience in the gallery unable to do much more than cower and seek to protect themselves as best they could. The gunman is then caught on camera waving the pistol, perhaps making some kind of attempt to leave the building. Shortly after this, Turkish security forces shot him dead. The 62-year-old career diplomat had been ambassador to Turkey for 3 years. He was married with a son. Obviously, they rushed Ambassador Karlov to hospital, but fought in vain to save him. The mayor of Ankara tonight described this as an attempt to wreck Turkish-Russian relations. Moscow said it was a terrorist act. One Russian commentator tonight told this program Western mainstream media was a factor in the assassination for churning out negative propaganda, he said, about Russia's war in Syria.
Obviously, some people in Turkey were under influence of that anti-Russian propaganda about Aleppo. And this is probably the main reason why the government decided to shoot the Russian ambassador.
Tonight, Turkish media reports say the gunman was Mert Altintas, who's a Turkish police officer in his early 20s. They say he was not on duty at the time, but it appears his police ID might have been enough to enable him to bring a weapon into the venue. As for the gunman himself, well, he said the weeks, the months of Russian bombardment of civilian areas across Syria, like East Aleppo, was his motive for doing what he did.
Well, we're joined now by the international analyst and author, Dr. Wolfgango Piccoli, and from Istanbul by the international relations professor, Dr. Gulnaz Aybniyet. Dr. Ulmer, can you tell us what kind of impact this is making on Turkey tonight?
Yes, well, I mean, this is a very heinous terrorist attack against the Russian ambassador, and our condolences and our thoughts and prayers go with the Russian people in this. Turkey is already facing a three-pronged terror attack from three organizations, and we've had two heinous attacks in Turkey in the past week alone. We're facing three terrorist organizations, basically the PKK, Daesh, and also FETÖ, which were behind the coup attempt on the 15th of July. And speculations at the moment, we're all in deep shock, obviously, about what happened. But it seems pretty obvious that, whoever was behind this wants to sabotage the recent rapprochement in Turkey-Russia relations, not just the evacuation of civilians from Aleppo that was brokered with Turkey's diplomatic initiatives with Turkey and Russia together, but also there's an upcoming trilateral meeting between Turkey, Russia, and Iran tomorrow in Moscow, which is still going ahead. And also there's another meeting, a bilateral meeting between Turkey and Russia in Astana that's to take place. And that meeting is going to look for a wider settlement of the war. And I think it was particularly to sabotage this meeting that probably this kind of attack happened.
But can I suggest a possibly more limited ambition? And that is, there must be many Sunnis in Turkey who found what has been happening in Syria and Russia's involvement in the massacres and the terrible, terrible incidents that have happened in Aleppo. They must, to some extent, be looking at Russia as being to blame.
Look, I mean, there are speculations at the moment. It's too early to say, but two speculations are going around. This could be a lone person who went completely crazy and decided to take matters into his own hands. And then, on the other hand, it could be something more sinister, like someone who's embedded within this movement that carried out the coup attempt, because we know that they're very much embedded in the police and the security forces. Right. And you're absolutely right. This is a predominantly Muslim country, but it's a country that's felt very strongly about the humanitarian catastrophe that's going on in Syria. And that's precisely why the government have negotiated with Russia very carefully to open a humanitarian corridor.
Right. Let me just go to our other guest, and I'll come back to you again. Dr. Wolfgango Piccoli, you actually deal in political risk. Yeah. You're a consultant. Now, did you foresee anything like this? I mean, the idea that there would be this kind of an incident and presumably shine a very big light on Russia-Turkey relations.
Nobody can predict something like this. This happened right in the center of Ankara, literally 200 meters away from the US embassy. And this gentleman, the attacker, was able to disguise himself within the security, the bodyguards of the ambassador, and shoot him there. So nobody can predict this.
But he seems to be an off-duty policeman.
Yes,
so that's pretty alarming too.
It is alarming on a variety of fronts here, because on the one side, the government will try to blame the usual suspect, the Gulenist. Still, the government, since the 15th of July failed coup, they've been purging a huge amount of policemen. So if this guy was a rotten apple, why is still there? How can he be next to the Russian ambassador and right in the core of Ankara? So there's certainly suspicion there. On the other way around, as you alluded, the pro-government media in Turkey has been condemning Russian action in Syria for a very long time. So as this attacker been somewhat incentivized by the atmosphere in Turkey? Absolutely. When the attack took place, there was a large demonstration next to the Russian consulate in Istanbul, protesting about the Russian action in Syria. So it could be a mix of factors here. I don't think it was a 22-year-old trying to sabotage Russia-Turkey ties. If it was something much more complex than that.
Well, now, the liberation of East Aleppo is not the end of the story. It's still going to be a continued civil war in Syria. How do you see Russian-Turkish relations evolving from that?
I think the two sides will try to keep the relationship going. The strategic interests at stake for both Moscow and Ankara are too high, too important to let it go because of this. Privately, certainly the Russians will express their anger about what happened today. I think the impact will be mainly on the economic front from the Turkish side. They hope that with this Russian-Turkish rapprochement, Russian tourists will start going back to Turkey. This was the largest amount of tourists visiting the country. This now is unlikely to happen anytime soon.
Dr. Aibnet, what do you make of the idea of an off-duty policeman who has survived the purges instituted by the president after the coup and still been able to do this?
Just a correction, the purges were not instituted by the president. There was an ongoing case in several cases, actually, by the chief prosecutor's office against this movement that were going on for 4 years before the coup attempt. And in fact, 3,000 people were about to be arrested just before the coup. So, I mean, this is an ongoing process that didn't just happen all of a sudden after the coup attempt. The second thing that I want to correct, something that Wolfango said, that it's not just been the pro-government press that have been, voicing their concerns against Russian actions in Syria, but all of the press here. So it's wrong to say.
There's very little press left that isn't pro-government, is there?
No, that's not true. There's a lot of opposition press still active. So I think that's also being very misrepresented in Western media.
The press situation in Turkey has become extremely bad, and you know that.
Well, we're not discussing that right now, though, are we? The Russian ambassador's just been shot. So I think, you should probably stick to the actual story that you're covering. But, the whole point of this is that, this whole thing about post 15th of July, why is there's still investigations going on to people that are in the police forces, even in the armed forces. We're actually hearing new suspensions that are happening every day because these investigations have not finished and they're still going on. So, it is quite plausible that this person could have been one of them, but I'm not saying that that's definitely the case. It could have also been a lone actor that's gone completely crazy by the various news and the tragic news that's coming out of Aleppo.
Right.
And that's all going to be investigated.
Well, Dr. Aibnet, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Turkey, and thank you very much indeed for coming in too, Kathy.
Thanks, Sean. Well, before the assassination, there had been rather more encouraging news from Syria. Thousands more civilians managed to leave rebel-held Aleppo today for relative safety, including a group of children who'd been trapped inside an orphanage. The evacuation resumed after a deal was struck allowing people out of 2 pro-government villages which had been under siege. Here's our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman.
They are living amid the bombed-out ruins of their city. They've survived months of shelling and airstrikes. And now, as they wait for the great escape to begin, the greatest danger facing them may be dying from the cold. This morning, that escape did begin. Thousands were evacuated after the deal with rebels, which collapsed on Friday, began to work. Some of those arriving in rebel-held areas said they'd waited on coaches for 10 hours without water before the 2-mile drive to this rebel-held district. But the joy of surviving a 4-year battle for their city eclipses everything else. A battle which Syrian rebels have now lost. Amid the evacuees was Bana Al-Abed, the 7-year-old girl who had appeared on social media alongside her mother to tell of the horrors of life under siege. All 47 children trapped in an underground orphanage also escaped today, though UNICEF said some were critically injured and that many other children are still left behind. Because the roads out of eastern Aleppo are now so clogged with desperate people clamouring to get out that the most desperate are not always reaching aid workers from the International Red Cross holding the line. It is still bedlam in the only working hospital, where the injured lie in bundles on the floor and where the hospital cleaner says he's been waiting 5 or 6 days for somebody to rescue his son. They're trying to clean the medical equipment because they don't know if the ceasefire will last or if dozens of patients they've prepared to evacuate will be sent back. Aleppo's evacuation depends on a deal allowing these government forces to take women and children and injured from two pro-government towns, Fua and Kafraya. Yesterday's convoy was attacked by jihadist rebels, but today they let it pass. We're supposed to allow the evacuation of 4,000 people, one of the rebels said, in exchange for all the people of Aleppo. And it may be only a matter of time before those who have escaped the city and are now being fed in the Syrian countryside find themselves in a self-declared jihadist state. Because many of the rebels here are linked to Al-Qaeda. They're ever more radicalized by Aleppo's destruction, and they're no doubt keen to recruit refugees of fighting age who've just arrived. And with the city's fall, jihadists are in the ascendancy now. The secular part of Syria's revolution is in retreat. Russian television today showed Syrians crossing the front line into eastern Aleppo, war tourists in their own shattered city. Thank you, Russia, for liberating us, this woman says. There is more than one narrative in this war, even if this one gets less of a hearing than the Russian-backed bombing of civilians. In the meantime, evacuees are heading out around the clock. Civilians and rebels alike allowed safe passage, with the Russians now allowing UN monitors to observe this for the first time.
Jonathan Rugman reporting. Well, now this morning, the United Nations Security Council finally, unanimously approved a resolution to send monitors to oversee the evacuation process and to ensure that civilians are protected, much to Syria's chagrin. Porrick O'Brien is in New York. Porrick.
Well, John, it was the French that did the running on this development over the weekend. Russia proposing a rival resolution, but heads were banged together. A compromise was reached. The crux of it, positioning UN monitors on the ground in East Aleppo. Just before we get to the detail of that, here's how Samantha Power, the US ambassador to the UN, reacted to the news this morning.
Getting these monitors in to eastern Aleppo, onto the buses, at the points of egress from the besieged part of eastern Aleppo, which is now very small but has in it tens of thousands of people still, that urgent implementation of this resolution is everything.
So what does any of this actually mean? Well, I pressed the UN spokesperson on that just before we came on air. The best he could tell me, he said there were 100 UN staff on the ground in Aleppo, but they're mainly in West Aleppo. The monitors will be first taken from that pool of people. Where will they be monitoring? They'll be positioned around the checkpoints around those besieged neighbourhoods. They'll be allowed, we understand, to board the buses as well. But the key question is, when does this all kick in? The aspiration, and it is just an aspiration, is that they'll start arriving tomorrow morning. As you said in the lead-in, John, the Syrian government not happy, reacting with suspicion, to say the least. Here's how their ambassador to the UN reacted.
France and Britain's insistence on presenting and adopting such resolution is just another part of the continued propaganda against Syria and its fight against terrorism. While we respect the Security Council resolutions, we are aware of the real purpose of their efforts, which is to protect the terrorists.
Now, this is a victory for the UN, but let's face it, it is a small victory for the UN, and it has to be put against the backdrop of a neutered UN, really, when it has come to Syria. You also have to ask, because these evacuations are starting to accelerate, as we heard today, what will actually be left to monitor? I mean, without being flippant about it, I think there's a real sense here that this small victory is like scraping a pass at school, but only after your school has burnt down.
Porrick O'Brien. Well, precisely those issues that Porrick has just mentioned is what I put to the UN's envoy in charge of humanitarian relief to Syria, Jan Egeland. I asked him how long he thought the final evacuation of eastern Aleppo could take.
It could be done in another 24 to 48 hours if everything goes right and we have this continuous operation through the night and the morning. It could then be maybe up to 40,000 people all together.
But the great sadness is that by the time this resolution of the United Nations is put into action and there are monitors on the ground, everyone will have been evacuated.
Well, or the good news, because what we need is people to be evacuated.
Surely what we've needed all along is monitors, is people on site in the country, avoiding some of the utter mayhem that has occurred.
What we need more than anything is men with guns and power to let humanitarians do their jobs. Listen, there has been hundreds of UN staff and Red Cross and Red Crescent staff on the ground throughout. It hasn't prevented these men from starving out besieged areas, from letting children bleed to death inside besieged areas, even when we begged for their evacuation to hospitals where their lives could have been saved.
In a sense, Jan Egeland, it's as if Rwanda has taught us no lessons. I mean, this is a terrible low point for the United Nations. I mean, this has been an abject failure.
It has. I mean, we're back to the bleakest chapters again of the history of international cooperation.
The tragedy is that we can look at Idlib and we can foresee the possibility that there could be another siege. And there might be monitors on the ground, there might not be monitors on the ground. But fundamentally, we're no better prepared now for dealing with the next siege than we were with dealing with this one.
Indeed, there are now 16 other besieged areas beyond East Aleppo. We reckon there to be 700,000 civilians in those other besieged areas, and they include Fua, Kefraya, Zabadani, and Madaya, which are places we hope to get a few evacuees out of now in the next 48 hours.
Then the ordinary citizenry looking in on this from across the world need to know this is not the beginning of the end.
No, it's not the beginning of the end, but it's perhaps the end of the beginning in the sense that we can now in 2017 end all of this. It can change. It can change tomorrow if there is concerted pressure on the parties on the ground and on their international sponsors. This is not a tsunami, it's not a natural disaster, it's man-made from A to Z.
And in the end, when all this is done, will there be cases brought for these appalling war crimes that have been perpetrated on a scale at times to rival the Second World War?
There has been gruesome war crimes throughout these 5 years. And I think, yes, there should be an hour of accountability. And there will be accountability then brought on a lot of men with guns and a lot of men with power to enable those men who did all of these horrific things on the ground, who did the bombing of the hospitals, who made children bleed to death without evacuation, who did target schools or bread lines.
Jan Egeland, he's the boss of the UN humanitarian effort in Syria. Now, cluster bombs supplied by Britain have been used by Saudi-led coalition forces in Yemen, where many civilians have been killed and injured in the fighting between rebels and government forces. The Defence Secretary told MPs a limited number of the BL-755 munitions had indeed been dropped during the conflict. All export from the UK during the 1980s. But, said Saudi Arabia, who is not a signatory to the International Treaty on Cluster Munitions, had pledged it would no longer use the bombs.
Saudi Arabia has now confirmed that it will not further use BL-755 cluster munitions, and I welcome that.
Well, now, the Conservative MP and former International Development Minister Desmond Swayne joins us now from Westminster. This is a pretty dreadful state of affairs, isn't it? I mean, the international community has banned the use of these things for 5 years. let's park the fact that these were British. The most important thing is that a country that says it wishes to be part of the international community has been using them.
Well, what's happening is in Yemen is dreadful, and this is indeed dreadful, but at least we have managed to secure a proper investigation, an admission and a undertaking not to use anymore, and even an undertaking that they might actually sign up to the convention with the rest of us not to use these weapons ever again.
Well, that will be a victory, but it has to be said in a wider context. What's going on in Yemen is absolutely terrifying, and it is awful that British arms are fueling it.
What is happening in Yemen is absolutely dreadful. There is a frightful war going on, but at least we are not in the position where we are with respect to Syria and Aleppo. We're not standing shouting from the touchlines in the hope that the players might take some notice. We have genuine influence because we do actually support the war aims of the coalition to see the legitimate government of Yemen restored. We support them, and we're providing their war effort with arms. That gives us an influence we wouldn't otherwise have.
It's perhaps strange, then, that the United States don't see it that way. They have pulled back on a lot of their weapons supplies.
They have cut one contract. They continue to supply weapons to Saudi Arabia.
Well, the British are still left out on a limb. This is a civil war between, as you say, a government and rebels, but it is not one which should involve a major Arab power with this weight of British-supplied armaments.
I disagree with you profoundly. What has happened is that a rebel regime, backed up by the former president of Yemen, who was thrown out in the Arab Spring, and financed and armed and backed by Saudi Arabia, by Iran, have taken power in Yemen, posing an existential threat to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is acting to defend itself.
Yeah, but Desmond Swain, you're falling for a bit of propaganda here. You have the Iranian involvement to the extent that these people are Shiite, but they are of a different sect. It is not a very close situation. They are not being provided with bombers or bombs. They are small arms and the rest of it. This is a one-way traffic in which, for example, the capital, Sana'a, has been absolutely destroyed by the Saudis.
With respect, you have fallen for Iranian propaganda. You're exactly right that these are not 12 Shia, any more than the Alawite sect in Syria are Shia. The nonsense is put out that these are part of the great Shia force by Iran.
Desmond Swain, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Kathy.
Thanks, John. Now, post office counters are closed, trains are cancelled and talks are underway to resolve a British Airways dispute which threatens to disrupt travel over Christmas. Number 10 today accused the unions of showing contempt for ordinary people, but they insist they're defending workers' pay and conditions. Southern Rail staff have walked out today and tomorrow in a dispute over the role of conductors. The action is causing more misery for the 300,000 passengers who use the service. Meanwhile, more than 1,500 UK airport staff, including check-in staff and baggage handlers, will strike for 48 hours from Friday in a long-running row with Swissport over pay and conditions. On top of that, 4,500 British Airways cabin crew will strike on Christmas Day and Boxing Day. And today, Weetabix staff announced they'll down tools sometime in the new year. To add to all that misery, post office workers are walking out today, tomorrow and Saturday, affecting around 300 branches, though most of them remain open. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Andy Davies.
The Royal Mail would still be collecting letters, but the main post office in Keynsham near Bristol today was firmly shut, to evident dismay.
Were you hoping to go into the post office?
I was hoping to go, but unfortunately there's a damn big sign saying we have packed it in, so hard luck.
Not very good. It's very inconvenient. I have the postcards and now I'm in the lurch, really.
5 miles away at the post office in Kingswood, staff were outside on the first of their 3-day strike action. But here the doors were open, with managers inside manning the counter. There are just over 11,500 post office branches around the UK. Most are run as franchises. This strike involves only the so-called Crown post offices, the 286 still directly managed by the post office. most of which, it was claimed confidently today, had been kept open.
It's had very little impact on our network. More than 97% of our network is run by independent sub-postmasters, so that's not affected. And of the 286 Crown branches which are potentially impacted, 250 of them are open as normal.
You're on strike, but the post office is open. What are you actually achieving here?
Well, the post office is open because it's staffed by managers. The vast majority of our staff up and down the UK are on strike today, defending their pensions, terms and conditions, and more importantly, the service for the general public and the business community.
So what's at the heart of this dispute? Well, pension changes and job security feature, but a central issue is the post office's current enthusiasm for relocating some of its bigger branches into the retail sector. Increasingly, Crown post offices are being relocated into stores like WH Smith, who often become the new employers of the post office staff. Same service, longer opening hours for the customer, claims the post office. Inevitable decline, claims the union.
I just think it's just another nail in the coffin for the post office, and it's about time the government stepped up the mark and tried to help us, like the banks.
As they took their message to Whitehall today, Santa's grotto and reindeer in tow, the government's response was distinctly unfestive. A spokesman for the Prime Minister claimed the strike action by these and others in the rail and airline industries this week was massively unwarranted and showed contempt for ordinary people. This was how they viewed the strikes back in Keynsham.
It sucks because it's this time of year, but then I also understand people have dissatisfaction with their jobs, so how else do you get noticed?
Well, it's all done for effect, isn't it? You know, crucial time, they're trying to make their demands really hit home. I have no sympathy.
What do you think of the fact that there are quite a lot of strikes happening this week in the run-up to Christmas?
Because that's maybe the only way they can get some impact, maybe. When
what, choosing this week?
Need it more this time of the year, don't they, people?
Do you have some sympathy with that?
Yes, I do.
Everybody's on strike, the whole bloody world's on strike, as far as I can. So everybody wants something for nothing or for something or extra, God knows what.
As he despaired, news of yet another impending strike emerged, this time involving workers at the cereal company Weetabix, embroiled in a dispute over new shift patterns. Their industrial action has been planned for the new year.
Andy Davis reporting there. Now, the Justice Secretary Liz Truss has admitted the problems in English jails won't be fixed in weeks or even months, as she made a statement in the Commons about the Birmingham prison riot. She insisted she was confident government reforms could turn things around. But there were more disturbances this weekend, allegedly involving inmates transferred after last week's unrest. Well, our Home Affairs correspondent Darshana Soni is in Birmingham now. Darshana, what's the latest?
Well, as the Justice Secretary made her statement today in the Commons, she was accused of losing her grip on jails and of ignoring previous warnings about staff shortages, levels of violence and the use of drugs here in Birmingham. Liz Truss said that there'll be an inquiry into what happened here on Friday. It started with 6 prisoners climbing onto some netting and ended with them being able to take control of 4 wings for some 12 hours. Now, wider questions were asked in the Commons about whether private companies should be able to profit from punishment, because G4S had to admit that for several hours it had lost control of the situation and it relied on the prison services teams to come in and calm things down. And the prison services teams were today praised for their handling of the situation. But Liz Truss was asked about what sanctions G4S would face, and this was her response.
And the perpetrators of this incident will feel the full force of the law, because the reality is that their actions have put both staff and prisoners at risk. He asked about G4S. They will be covering the cost of what has happened at HMP Birmingham, including the resources that have been employed by the public sector.
Well, the Minister talked about the problem of drugs, phones and drones in prisons, but what she didn't dwell on was the fundamental issue of overcrowding. Now, it's something that 3 of her predecessors tried to grapple with, but it's such a politically sensitive issue, the question of whether we should be sending fewer people to prison. And I've learned that in the past 2 months, HMP Birmingham was asked to take 50 prisoners from other jails across the country, despite being at full capacity themselves. And some of those 50 prisoners included men who were accused of rioting at Bedford Prison. And critics say that all that is happening is that the problem is being transferred from jail to jail. And we saw this weekend what happens in that situation when 15 prisoners transferred from Birmingham ended up in Hull and causing a disturbance there. Now, the government says it is investing more money, but as Liz Truss herself admitted, there are no easy or quick fixes.
Darshana Soni, it looks as if we've just lost you in time to avoid an exhibitionist. Now, football's world governing body, FIFA, has fined all 4 home nations over their use of the poppy during November's international games. Black armbands featuring the poppy were worn by the English and Scottish teams during a World Cup qualifying match. The English FA received the biggest fine of around £35,000. FIFA does not allow political symbols to be displayed during matches. And Wales and Northern Ireland were also fined for rule breaches, including fans wearing poppies in the stand. The IMF chief, Christine Lagarde, has been convicted of negligence by a special French court over her role in a controversial payout to a leading businessman in 2008. The court decided not to hand down any punishment over the award after Ms. Lagarde insisted she had always acted in good faith. The IMF's executive board is meeting now to consider the implications of the ruling. Kathy.
Thanks, John. Well, if the world's major institutions are looking distinctly shaky, so too is the European Union, heading for an uncertain future after Brexit. Britain's hopes of forging new independent relationships with the rest of the world were given a boost by Australia, whose High Commissioner to the UK promised a new trade deal would be reached quickly. Life outside the EU, he said, would be very good. Well, we'll hear from Alexander Downer in a moment, but first from Westminster, Victoria MacDonald reports.
Yes, Kathy, today Theresa May came to the House of Commons to report on her meeting with the European Council last week. A meeting at which, at one point, the pictures appeared to show her seeming isolated. That guest standing in the corner of the party when everybody else has gone off into another room, that everybody else being the other 27 ministers. Now, she said in the Commons today that it was completely understandable that these ministers would want to discuss Brexit and what would happen to them and get the best possible deal once the UK leaves the European Union, just as it is perfectly understandable that we need to discuss the best deal for the UK. And she appeared to very much play down those pictures. Yet in the Commons today, Jeremy Corbyn said that it appeared that UK and Mrs May was becoming increasingly isolated on the international stage.
It's also clear, Mr Speaker, through my own discussions with European leaders that they're becoming increasingly frustrated by her shambolic government and the contradictory approach to Brexit negotiations. The mixed messages from her front bench only add to the confusion.
He talks about confusion on the front bench. Well, he has obviously been looking at his own front bench when he considers this matter. With the right honourable gentleman's negotiation techniques, if he was in office, we'd sure as goodness be getting the worst possible deal that we could get for the United Kingdom.
Well, talking about confusion, I mean, nothing was made particularly clear in her statement and her questions today in the House of Commons. Over the weekend, we heard Liam Fox, that hard Brexiteer, though, suddenly starting to talk about the customs union and whether we could remain part of that or take bits of it. This is the tariff deal that the EU does to trade with the rest of the world. Now, he has always been adamant that we shouldn't be part of that. And today, Downing Street said that he was right to start discussing this. So they used the word to float this. But Mrs May said that, of course, nothing has been decided or negotiated. And repeatedly today, she kept saying that she did not want to go into the processes. What she was most interested in was the outcome.
Victoria, thanks very much. Well, the Australian High Commissioner to the UK, Alexander Downer, joins me now, and with him the Conservative MP, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and the French political commentator, Agnès Poirier. Alexander Downer first. You've suggested that life outside the EU for the UK could be pretty rosy. What are you basing that on?
Well, I'm just making the point I didn't actually say about the UK, but for Australia, we've never been in the European Union, and we haven't done too badly as a country in spite of that apparent so-called disadvantage. But I would make this point. Firstly, what Australia really needs, and I'm sure the rest of the world really needs, is a smooth negotiation between the European Union and the United Kingdom. Well, we're not taking sides in that, but there are no barriers to trade between the United Kingdom and the European Union now. And we're not looking forward to a time when the global economy would be disrupted by either side erecting tariff and quota barriers to trade between the European Union and the United Kingdom. This would be a very negative outcome for the rest of the world. So we just hope that the European Union and the UK will have a smooth transition to a new arrangement.
And you know how to do smooth negotiations, because according to you, I mean, what you've done 8 free trade agreements in 12 years. You seem pretty confident about doing a deal between Australia and the UK. I mean, could it be done, do you think, in 15 months, which is what you managed to do with your deal with the US?
Well, we know from great experience that negotiating free trade agreements depends ultimately on political will. Now, obviously, there are great similarities systemically between Australia and the UK, and there's very similar outlook, including on economics. So I suspect it would be a lot easier to do a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom than it would be for us to do a free trade agreement with a country like China, although we've achieved a free trade agreement with China. But with the UK, I think it would be, we can't be sure, but I think it would be relatively straightforward.
Let me pin you down on that. 15 months or less?
Well, you would never know, but it depends on this.
But given that's what it took for you to do a deal with the US?
Exactly. Why did it take only 15 months with the US? Because there was the political will on the part of the Australian government at the time and the American president. We've got to do the deal. Let's do it nice and quickly. Let's cast aside obstacles between our countries. If the British government takes the view that it doesn't want to erect barriers to protect particular industries against Australian exports to the UK, then we could do a deal pretty quickly.
OK, so that's possible, Jacob Rees-Mogg, but then when you look at Theresa May accused of sort of shambolic negotiations so far. She hasn't started negotiations, but it's all a bit shambolic. Is it possible, therefore, to do these deals quickly? Do you have confidence in that?
It's not shambolic at all. It's extraordinarily clear. Negotiations will start once Article 50 is issued. The European Union is refusing to discuss anything until the Article 50 negotiation is started, and that will be by the 31st of March. There's nothing yet to be shambolic about. It's clear that we will leave, and it is clear that we will make our own laws, we will not have the European Court of Justice, and we will make our own trade arrangements.
But there's lots
this is absolutely clear and straightforward.
Well, there's lots of mixed signals coming out from all the various ministers responsible for the whole business of Brexiting. So it's not exactly a seamless, this smooth deals that...
I don't think that's right. I think it's very clear how we will go into the negotiations and that we will leave at the end of 2 years. We will then be free to make negotiated settlements with other countries, and Australia ought to be an absolutely top priority. It's a nation we've had friendly dealings with over hundreds of years, used to be very close to economically, and I think that should be our #1 priority once we've left.
Agnes Poirier, it sounds like a deal between the UK and Australia is sort of almost in the bag. Does that make you more optimistic?
Well, optimism is good, but I don't, the optimism of Brexiteers is, I don't know whether to find it truly admirable or simply mad, or at the very least deluded.
Are you calling him mad?
Optimism is good, lucidity is actually a better quality. I mean, it's 6 months after the referendum. Article 50 hasn't been triggered yet. At least we know, OK, it's going to be in 3 months' time. But, I think, to talk about the economy and trade agreements, I think we should talk about politics first, because if there's a political will, then, of course, trade deals can be done much more smoothly. But, Theresa May has 3 Mr. Brexit, and they say different things in Parliament, and then you've got the PM saying, well, actually, this is not the views of the government, so I don't see any clarity. Seen from Europe, we don't see clarity. We see ideology clouding what is going to be a very technical and complex task.
Quick response to that?
Mrs May is extremely clear, and her ministers have made it clear that they are not giving a running commentary, and that has allowed people to make wild speculations, but the government's position is clear. The speculators are off with the fairies.
Well, address the point of the political will, because, that's the point, isn't it? Canada's deal with the EU took 7 years. That doesn't give you cause for
Well,
optimism,
you had
does
to
it?
reach an agreement with a lot of countries there to reduce tariff barriers and quota barriers, and by a lot of countries, the European Union is 28 countries, so there's 29 countries negotiating. Now,
So the future's in bilateral deals.
So the point I'd make about Britain and the European Union is that there are no tariffs at the moment between Britain and the European Union. So the question that we outsiders ask the British and the Europeans is this: are you planning to increase tariffs or impose tariffs and quotas on trade between Britain and the European Union? And if you do, you will cause disruption not just to your own economies but to the global economy. And we, as Australians, and I know I speak for many other countries in the world, which is more people than there are in the European Union, we don't want to see that happen.
The High Commissioner is absolutely right. It could not be in the interests of the United Kingdom to put barriers on the European Union selling goods to us. If the European Union wants to put barriers on UK trade, it would damage their own consumers, their own voters and the global economy.
But that is the point. The UK is in a position of power here, isn't it? Because the EU sells more to us than we sell to them.
Well, everybody's in a position of power or weakness, depending on how you look at it.
Do you not buy that argument, though?
Well, I mean, you do and you don't. We still don't know, what Britain wants, what kind of model, I mean, David Davis says in Parliament he wants us close and access to the single market as he possibly could, but then he wouldn't buy any free movement. But the two go together. So, I mean,
well, no deal can,
clarity,
but no deal can rival.
It's a complete red herring. Australia sells lots of goods into the European single market and does not have free movement of people with the European Union. China sells billions of pounds worth of goods to the European Union, and we do not have free movement of people with China. Selling goods to people and free movement are completely separate.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, Agnes Poirier, Alexander Downer, thank you very much for joining me all.
Thank you.
John.
After the break, she was deceived by an undercover cop. Tonight, in her first television interview, a former social worker described the trauma and the anger that has since damaged her life. A woman deceived into a relationship with an undercover police officer has given her first television interview about the trauma, the anger and the damage done to her life. The former social worker describes how she spent the last 5 years trying to uncover the truth about Marco Jacobs, who disappeared in 2009. Only last month, the undercover public inquiry confirmed that Jacobs was an officer deployed to infiltrate anarchist groups. Tonight, police say they are close to a compensation settlement with her. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent, Simon Israel, has this exclusive report.
Still haunts me every day because I don't know what my life would have been like if he hadn't invaded it, basically. I've built him up to be a monster, really, because he had this physically powerful man with all this power behind him from the state and that he abused. It was a very traumatic realisation that a person that had been a major part of my life over years wasn't real.
This is the person she's referring to. He used the name Marco Jacobs. He was a police undercover officer deployed to infiltrate the Cardiff anarchist network a decade ago. And to do that, he used this woman, whose identity we have agreed to protect, to infiltrate the organisation.
He was very friendly from the outset, very warm, seemed to pay a lot of attention to me from the beginning, really, and I remember thinking, oh, he's a nice man.
Why do you think you were targeted by him?
I don't know if it's because I was a certain type of person. Perhaps he saw I was vulnerable in some ways, having experienced certain health problems, being a certain type of person, perhaps someone he felt he could manipulate, possibly. Someone he thought would respond well to having their self-esteem and confidence boosted in the way he did.
Their lives became ever closer at activist meetings and on demonstrations. The spy cop would even volunteer to be a flag waver.
It was all quite a surprise, and I guess quite exciting at the same time. He said that he'd moved to Cardiff because of me. He said that he'd left his previous girlfriend because of me. He said he thought I was amazing. He said, "Oh, you're an amazing woman." I guess because we had such a strong, I trusted him so much and didn't even think to question it wasn't real what he was saying.
Did he ever say he loved you?
In the morning, yeah, he said, it was in the morning, and I was surprised, but he said, "I definitely love you." And I don't think I responded because I didn't know, I was kind of in shock, I guess, and obviously feeling pretty bad about what had happened and guilty. But also I was kind of happy that, you know, it was an experience that I enjoyed with someone I trusted and felt that I knew quite well, and I thought was supportive.
So supportive that when her father was dying of cancer, the undercover police officer was there, providing her with the shoulder to lean on.
He told me his dad died quite recently, and he said, I know what you're going through. My dad was ill for a very long time, but it was he died suddenly in the end, and it was pretty traumatic. He died in A&E, and we didn't expect it, so it was really difficult. And I felt Marco was particularly supportive and understanding, and it was really comforting, I guess. And I think, yeah.
Then came the Disappearing Act in 2009. Marco Jacobs claimed he'd got a job as a handyman at a holiday complex in Corfu. The text then dried up. The phone went dead.
My initial feelings were I was worried. I thought something had happened. I remember Googling for news of an accident, of a British man, something happening to a British man in Corfu. I started to look on, putting posts on like missing persons websites or expat forums, saying looking for this guy.
He'd vanished?
He'd vanished, yeah. There was no sign of him whatsoever. And that's when I started to realise there's no one we could ask. We didn't know any of his family. We didn't know any of his friends outside of Cardiff or outside of activism.
And that's barely changed. She spent the last 5 years trying to find out more, but every inquiry has been stonewalled by a police policy of neither confirming nor denying.
It still haunts me every day because I don't know what my life would have been like if he hadn't invaded it, basically. Because he did change things. He changed how I felt about people. I wonder how I would have reacted to my father's death if he wasn't around. I feel like he interfered with that grieving. He interfered with my family life. He interfered with my work. And perhaps one of his main aims was to interfere with my political activity. It made me question my activism and the purposefulness of it and why I was doing it. And I think he did that with a lot of people, and I think one of his aims was to disrupt the political activity and disrupt relationships within the group, which he did very successfully, and by the time he left Cardiff there was no functioning. The political group I was involved in was no longer meeting, and some of us weren't talking to each other.
Last month there was at last an official acknowledgement. Jacobs was an undercover police officer. Tonight, the Metropolitan Police disclosed it was close to an agreement for compensation and an apology. But that's not all. The 36-year-old has learned she features in thousands of files on police databases, and she wants them erased. For in all her former UK activism, she was never once arrested or charged.
Simon Israel reporting. Now, tonight's main news, the Russian ambassador to Turkey has been shot dead by an off-duty policeman in the centre of the capital, Ankara, as he gave a speech in an art gallery. The gunman shouted, "Don't forget Aleppo," as he opened fire. Now, some breaking news. In the last few minutes, German police have confirmed one person is dead and several are injured after a lorry ploughed into a crowd close to a Christmas market in Berlin. With the latest, Diana Magne is with me now. What do we know?
John, I've just spoken to a policewoman at the scene. She told me that, in fact, several people have died, several more wounded. We know that at around 8 o'clock German time, so a little under an hour ago, an articulated lorry drove into a Christmas market, really in one of the most central Christmas markets in Berlin. And it's very early days, but all the indicators are at the moment that it might have been a premeditated attack.
Well, it does seem that there is speculation rising because local police have some view on this. But in the midst of this frenetic atmosphere after the Russian ambassador's assassination, I mean, what are people saying in Berlin?
Well, we are hearing initial reports that the police do believe this was an attack, but it is very early days. It didn't even happen an hour ago now. But a Christmas market is, of course, a very soft target.
Do we know what happened to the driver?
We don't know if the driver is alive or what happened at all, but I've been watching videos from the scene, and it is a state of chaos. As you can imagine, the emergency vehicles are there now. But certainly, I spoke to a policewoman about 10 minutes ago. She said several wounded and several dead.
Diana Magnay, thank you very much indeed. Well, by any account, a very shocking evening's news, starting with the assassination of the Russian ambassador in Ankara and, of course, concluding with this recent breaking news coming in from Berlin. That's all from us tonight.
There's plenty more on our website, and all those breaking stories you can look on our website or on our Facebook page. channel4.com/news is our web address. But we're back at 7 tomorrow. Until then, that's Channel 4 News. Have a very good evening.
Good evening.